Hi everyone, welcome to Evolution Part 2, screencast number 3. When we talk about a species, we know that a species is if two individuals can interbreed, then they are said to be part of the same species. And they can also produce fertile offspring. When divergence occurs, it means that two individuals are no longer a part of the same species. That's going to be identified by whether or not they can interbreed and produce a fertile offspring or not. The common ancestor is still going to remain, but divergence is the development of a new species. Speciation, formation of a new species, divergence is the driving force behind this speciation. There can be subspecies that exist. All dogs are Canis familiaris. They're all part of the same species, but there's obviously different breeds of dogs, so they're said to be a subspecies. And that's due to artificial selection. Remember, that is selecting for traits that we find favorable. They are still the same species, just subspecies of each other. There's two major models of evolution. You see this gradual change that can occur over long periods of time, and also what's known as punctuated equilibrium. This is rapid change that's separated by periods of little to no change. We'll maybe touch on that a little bit more later. Macroevolution, long time scale events that can create and destroy species. Macro means big, so these are large, big, long time scales versus microevolution. Short time scale, this can be more on the scale of generation to generation. This is going to affect the genotypes and phenotypes of populations. A very common example you'll see whenever talking about evolution is the peppered moth example. You have these peppered moths. This was like how a tree would look pre-industrial revolution. You see that it's lighter, and you see that you have this light color. You can't really see it because it's blending in so well. That's a good adaptation of this light colored peppered moth, camouflage. Can't really see it. The one that you're going to see if you're a hungry bird is going to be this darker one here. After the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot more soot on trees and surfaces. Now there's a switch, right? If you were a bird, this white peppered moth would stick out more. So you're going to see that one and you're going to eat that one. That's going to cause a shift in the population of dark versus light peppered moths. That's microevolution. We can see that occurring from generation to generation, and there's a change in the genotypes and phenotypes of populations. Different evidence for evolution, embryonic development. I think we talked about most of these in the last screencast, but I figured why not just talk about them again. Microevolution, body structures, biological molecules, DNA, and the fossil record. Looking at microevolution, we just talked about that, the peppered moth example. And then also pesticide or antibiotic resistance. This is another example of evolution. This is some pathogen, let's say bacteria. If we use, let's say, Lysol or Clorox wipe, we're going to kill 99.9% of the virus or bacteria. However, the ones that are going to survive are going to be really strong. They're going to be the ones that survived, the 0.1%, and they're going to reproduce. So the later generations are going to develop a resistance to the Clorox wipes or the Lysol or whatever you're using. This causes a lot of concern for people because what happens when a really dangerous pathogen is resistant to all of the antibiotics that we use? Same thing for insecticide application. You have an insecticide that's going to kill the majority of insects. However, one is going to be the lucky survivor because it had traits that were favorable for surviving whatever the insecticide is. That survivor is going to be able to reproduce and pass its genes on to the next generation. Then you'll have a generation that is immune or is not affected by the insecticide. The same thing can be said in evolution of drug resistance in HIV. The strongest viral particles are going to be the ones that survive, and then they are going to be the ones that pass their. Viruses don't really reproduce like bacteria do. They have to infect a host cell, they have to affect human cells. Then the strongest ones are going to be able to infect the host cells even after rounds of antiviral medications. Then the strongest viral particles are going to be the ones that survive and continue to infect the host cells. Similarities in DNA sequence is also more evidence for evolution. The more alike two organisms are, the more alike their DNA is. If two organisms are not very closely related, their DNA sequence is going to be pretty different. If we look at this example here, let's look at the DNA sequence. So this is the number of DNA nucleotide base differences in cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is responsible, it's a protein that's responsible for something called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. Cells go through a natural life cycle. Certain cells are going to survive a lot longer than other cells, like skin cells. They last about 2 weeks versus a brain cell you have for your entire life. So different cells in your body have different lengths of life. Cytochrome C is responsible for that timeline, essentially. You can look here at the DNA sequence differences between organisms of cytochrome C. And what this is showing us is that there's not really a lot of close relatedness between yeast and humans because there's so many differences in this certain gene, so this cytochrome C oxidase gene. Again, looking at similarities in DNA sequences, the more closely related two organisms are, the more amino acids, or I guess the more similar their genes are. Genes code for amino acids, which code for proteins, and I know we haven't talked about that yet. But the more closely related two organisms are, the more similar their DNA is going to be. An example is chimpanzees and humans are nearly identical. There are some slight differences, and that makes sense because we, more recently than a lot of other species, share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. Again, it's not that we evolved from chimpanzees, because if that were the case, there would be no more chimpanzees. It's correct, though, to say we share a common ancestor relatively recently with chimpanzees than we do with, say, something like a fish or yeast. Homologous structures, looking at vertebrates, we see that there's a lot of similarities in their skeletal structure, even though it could be two totally different things, like a bat and a human. Obviously very different, but we still have similar structures. And that is evidence for evolution because it's saying that we still have similar traits from when we descended from a common ancestor. And then they just are going to differ in form, definitely. Here's some more examples of that, and this is very similar. So you see like the hand bones in a cat, a whale, and a bat, and a gorilla. They're totally different in structure, but they still have similar parts, right? So here's the arm bone, the upper arm bone, the radius and ulna would be here in blue, the wrist bones in the green, and then the hand bones in the red. Similar structure, just different functions. Vestigial structures we talked about also. It just doesn't seem to serve a purpose for that organism anymore, even though maybe once upon a time it was very beneficial. Pelvic bone of whales. Obviously, whales don't walk anymore, but their ancestor was, if you remember that Ambulocetus, which did walk on land, it still has a pelvic bone from its common ancestor. And then appendix in humans, our appendix doesn't really have much of a function for us anymore. wisdom teeth don't really have a function, even though maybe at one time they did. Maybe it helped us grind up plant matter when we were living in an environment where we were needed to extract more nutrients from plant matter, or it could be from one of our herbivore ancestors. Another piece of evidence for evolution is similarities in early development. A lot of embryos, I think that's the next slide, yes. So similarities in embryonic development. We see that it doesn't matter what the species is, embryos look very similar. And obviously, these organisms are going to change as they grow and develop in the womb and outside of the womb, but they are still very similar looking when they are developing early on in embryonic development. The fossil record is also very good evidence for evolution. It has information about past life on Earth, and the fossil record is definitely incomplete because not all organisms are going to turn into fossils when they die. The conditions have to be favorable for an organism to turn into a fossil. So 99% of all species, I want to say it's actually more like 99.9% of all species that have ever lived on Earth have become extinct. So we're really only part of 1 or 0.1% of extant species that are still alive on Earth. Here's some really cool images of some fossils of some extinct organisms that are no longer on Earth. Again, when we talked about at the beginning, during Aristotle's time, and for a long time after that, it was just accepted that all the species that are on Earth today are the ones that always have been and always will be. And when we started to observe the fossil record, that's when that information changed. And that's pretty much it. This is the video that I had you guys watch. So hopefully you got a little bit more from this screencast, just going through everything again. I know it's probably a lot of information, but I hope that it all makes sense. And I like to, like I said, think about some of the stuff that we talked about previously when we looked at different adaptations of animals that were living in the biomes. Why do they have those adaptations? Well, remember, survival of the fittest. It's so they're able to survive, reproduce, pass their genes on to the next generation. Those favorable traits are going to therefore be passed on again, and that's how species eventually evolve, and that's how we get some variation, or not some, a ton of variation in all of the species that are alive or extant on Earth today. And also another major takeaway that I hope you got from this, it's incorrect to say we evolved from chimps or we evolved from fish. If you hear somebody say that, then you have my full permission to correct them and say we didn't evolve from them, but we share a common ancestor with them. And that common ancestry shared by life on Earth is really an amazing thing, that we all are interconnected in some way, and not just humans, not just Homo sapiens, but all life on Earth. We all share a common ancestry, so we all have similar traits, we all have similar genes, some more similar than others, but all life is life, and I find that to be a really beautiful and interesting thing. I hope you got a lot out of this, and as always, let me know if there are any questions, and you can put them in the comments, or if I do end up posting this to YouTube, I still haven't decided yet, or just email me, reach out to me anyway, and I will talk to you guys soon.